The rain pounded against the deserted highway, each drop a hollow echo in the vast emptiness. Evelyn tightened her grip on the wheel, her pulse quickening as the neon glow of a lone motel flickered in the distance. Something felt off. The air was thick, charged with an unshakable sense of unease. As she stepped inside, the old man behind the counter barely met her eyes. But before handing over the key, he muttered something under his breath, words that sent a chill down her spine. "No one stays in room 6 and leaves the same." Evelyn swallowed hard. A single key dangled from his trembling fingers, the brass tag glinting under the dim light. What was waiting for her behind that door? A billionaire in handcuffs over a $9 chocolate bar. What happened next turned a routine shopping trip into a national scandal that exposed a system designed to break those it was meant to serve. Lena Vaughn wasn't just a tech mogul, she was an architect of the digital age, a visionary who had transformed the way people lived, worked, and connected. Despite her vast wealth, she preferred a life away from the spotlight, directing her fortune into causes that mattered, revolutionizing education, funding mental health initiatives, and rebuilding communities from the ground up. But on one fateful afternoon in San Francisco, all of that faded into insignificance when she found herself at the center of an incident so absurd, so shocking, that it would ignite a conversation about justice, privilege, and power in ways she never anticipated. It started as a simple errand. Dressed in an understated navy blazer, jeans and sneakers, clothes chosen to blend in rather than stand out, Lena stepped into a high-end organic grocery store, the kind that catered to tech elites and wellness enthusiasts. The air smelled of fresh sourdough and artisanal coffee. As she wandered through the aisles, enjoying a rare moment of normalcy, for years her assistants had handled these mundane tasks, but today she wanted to remind herself what it felt like to just exist, to be another face in the crowd. The store hummed with casual chatter. A mother soothed the crying toddler near the fresh produce. A businessman scrolled through emails, while absent-mindedly tossing overpriced snacks into his cart, and a pair of tourists marveled at the absurd price of avocados. It was all so perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. As Lena reached for a bar of dark chocolate, a piercing alarm shattered the calm. The sound was jarring, like a fire alarm ripping through a quiet night. Shoppers froze, heads snapping in her direction. A uniformed security officer appeared almost instantly, eyes locked on her with a level of suspicion so immediate, so absolute, that it stunned her. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," the officer said, voice clipped and authoritative. Lena blinked, momentarily thrown. "Excuse me," she asked, her tone controlled but laced with confusion. "You didn't scan that item." The officer gestured toward the chocolate bar in her hand, their voice carrying across the store like a public indictment. Lena exhaled slowly, maintaining her composure. "I haven't even reached the register yet," she replied evenly, motioning toward the checkout lanes just a few feet away. But the explanation didn't matter. The narrative had already been written, and she was the villain of the story. In a matter of seconds, everything escalated. Another employee approached, a manager this time, their expression carefully blank but their stance rigid. A call crackled through the store's radio system. Possible shoplifting, detained suspect, and before she could process the absurdity of the situation, cold metal pressed against her wrists, handcuffs. A billionaire accused of stealing a $9 chocolate bar. A hush fell over the store, then the murmurs started. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else whispered her name. Recognition spread like wildfire. And in that instant Lena knew, this wasn't just about her. This was about something bigger. And she wasn't going to let it end here. The employee had already called for backup. Within moments 2 more staff members arrived, their rigid postures exuding authority. One of them muttered into a walkie-talkie, eyes flicking toward her with a scrutiny that felt rehearsed, like they had already decided how this story would end. Then came the announcement, cold and final: "We're calling the police." Lena Vaughn barely had time to process the absurdity of the situation before she felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. The supermarket, once just a blur of everyday life, had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, and she was the accused standing trial in the court of public opinion. Whispers slithered through the aisles like smoke, wrapping around her, suffocating, suspicious, entitled. The words weren't meant for her to hear, but she did. They cut through the manufactured silence like knives, each one sharper than the last. Yet she remained still, her expression unreadable, not because she wasn't shocked, she was, but because she had learned long ago that the moment you let them see you flinch, they owned you. What the store employees and the gathering crowd didn't realize was that Lena Vaughn wasn't just another customer in an expensive blazer. She wasn't just another woman who could be humiliated into compliance. She was a storm contained in a whisper, a force that had reshaped the digital world with a mere idea. Her story didn't start in glass towers or private jets. It started in the cramped one-bedroom apartment, where she and her mother fought to keep the lights on, where she learned to turn adversity into fuel. Born in the outskirts of Chicago, she had clawed her way into a scholarship at MIT, slept on borrowed couches while building her first AI prototype, and outmaneuvered billion-dollar corporations before she could legally rent a car. Her name wasn't just on tech patents, it was embedded in a generation's way of life. But despite all of it, here she was, reduced to nothing more than a nameless suspect over a misunderstanding too absurd to be real. Her wealth had never been her armor. It had been her weapon, one she wielded not for power but for change. She had poured millions into education, designed housing programs that pulled families out of poverty, and ensured that no child with a dream was denied the resources to chase it. Yet none of that mattered now, not to the employees, not to the shoppers with their sideways glances, not to the security officer whose hand twitched near his belt as if she were a threat that needed to be neutralized. Lena exhaled, slow and deliberate. She could have explained herself, could have argued, fought, demanded to see the manager who would undoubtedly recognize her name the moment it was spoken, but she didn't. Not yet, because this moment was bigger than her. It was a test, one she had seen play out for others time and time again, but never expected to face herself. Would the system bend in her favor, or was she about to be reminded that no matter how high you climb, there are still places where you are only what they choose to see? The silence thickened, the sirens in the distance grew louder, and Lena Vaughn, billionaire, innovator, survivor, stood there waiting, not for their verdict, for her moment. The moment the police entered, the store's atmosphere shifted from quiet suspicion to full-blown spectacle. Lena Vaughn felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on her. As the two officers scanned the scene, their unreadable expressions masking whatever judgment they had already made, the employees wasted no time, pointing her out as if identifying a fugitive. The older officer, his uniform crisp and his stance rigid, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we received a report of shoplifting. We need you to step outside with us." His tone was firm, authoritative, leaving no room for negotiation. Lena met his gaze, her posture unyielding. "I was going to pay for everything in my car. This is a misunderstanding." Her voice was steady, controlled, but inside something simmered, something more potent than anger. She had spent years navigating rooms filled with men who underestimated her, dismissing her as just another ambitious outsider. But this wasn't about business politics. This was about something far more primal, the way people decided who belonged and who didn't, who was guilty before they even spoke. The officer's eyes flickered toward the store manager, who stepped forward with newfound confidence now that authority was on his side. "She was caught red-handed," the manager declared, his voice laced with certainty. The olive oil was clearly unscanned, and she refused to comply when questioned. Lena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. "I wasn't refusing to comply," she corrected, her tone sharp but controlled. "I was explaining that I hadn't checked out yet." She gestured toward the self-checkout lanes, where a half-dozen customers stood scanning their items undisturbed. Everything in my cart was meant to be paid for, but her words didn't matter. They never did in moments like the assumptions had already been made, the lines drawn. Let's discuss this outside, the officer repeated, this time less like a request and more like an order. Lena could see the way the younger cop, who looked barely out of training, shifted uncomfortably, like he knew something felt off, but wasn't sure how to challenge it. But the older officer, he was unwavering, a man who had spent years following protocol, unwilling to deviate from the script he had likely followed hundreds of times before. As they led her outside, the whispers in the crowd grew louder, their murmurs coiling around her like a noose. People whispered, pointed, pulled out their phones. She could already see the headlines. Tech billionaire caught shoplifting. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. It didn't matter that she had built an empire from nothing, revolutionized industries, or poured millions into community programs. The world loved to fall from grace. And this was the kind of scandal they craved. The flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car cast eerie reflections across the parking lot. As she stepped outside, a chill ran through the air. But Lena didn't shiver. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The store manager, emboldened by the officers, puffed out his chest. "We have security footage," he boasted. She took the olive oil and never scanned it. Lena raised an eyebrow, then checked the footage. Her voice was calm, but beneath it was an unspoken challenge. "Let's see the part where I was still shopping, where I hadn't even reached the checkout yet." The younger officer hesitated, as if considering her words. But before he could speak, the older one pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The unmistakable metallic click sliced through the air like a blade. Lena's jaw tightened. This was the moment where she could fight back, demand a manager, make a scene, or she could let them underestimate her just a little longer. She took a breath, then extended her wrists. "Go ahead," she said, her voice smooth as steel. "Arrest me." The crowd gasped, because what they didn't know, what no one in that parking lot could have possibly anticipated, was that Lena Vaughn never lost. And this was only the beginning. The cold steel of the cuffs locked around Lena Vaughn's wrists. With an unceremonious click, a hush fell over the gathered crowd, their stares morphing from idle curiosity to silent horror. A woman of her stature, ruthless innovator, billionaire entrepreneur, architect of change, was being paraded through a dimly lit supermarket parking lot, like a common criminal. The irony tasted bitter. Her pulse remained steady as she was ushered toward the patrol car, her every movement scrutinized. A young woman near the entrance of the store had her phone raised, recording everything. Lena's eyes met hers for a fleeting moment. Sympathy, outrage. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was watching. "Are we sure this is necessary?" The younger officer's voice barely reached her ears, uncertainty laced in his tone. "It's protocol," his partner answered flatly, not bothering to meet his gaze. Protocol. The word echoed in Lena's mind, a neat little excuse to justify the absurdity unfolding around her. She had built entire infrastructures on efficiency, yet here she was, at the mercy of a system that thrived on inefficiency and assumption. As she slid into the back seat of the squad car, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The doors locked with a finality that sent a ripple of anger through her, though she forced her expression to remain impassive. Through the window she saw the recording woman still watching, her phone a silent witness to the spectacle. The car rumbled to life, and the city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the police radio, and the rhythmic tapping of Lena's fingers against her knee, measured, calculated, controlled. She had faced more dangerous situations than this. Boardrooms filled with corporate sharks, government officials who wanted to dismantle her work, the relentless skepticism of an industry dominated by those who never wanted her there in the first place. She had survived it all, conquered it, turned doubt into opportunity. But this was something else. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their sterile glow casting harsh shadows against the worn tile floor. The air smelled of disinfectant and cold bureaucracy. She stepped out of the vehicle, head high, posture unyielding. If they expected humiliation, they'd be sorely disappointed. A desk sergeant eyed her as she was led inside, but his face gave away nothing. Just another case, another file, another person processed through the endless churn of the system. Lena could already hear the murmurs building behind her, officers quietly exchanging words. Someone recognized her now, but it didn't matter. The machine had already started turning, and stopping it would take more than recognition. "Empty your pockets," one of the officers ordered. His voice clipped. Lena obeyed, methodically placing her belongings onto the counter. A sleek black phone, a set of keys, a money clip. The officer picked up the phone, studied the screen for a moment, then set it aside. "Sit tight," he muttered before disappearing down a hallway. Lena exhaled slowly, her mind already running through contingencies. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what came next. The fallout, the headlines, the conversations this moment would ignite. Let them underestimate her. Let them write their assumptions in ink. Because by the time this was over, she wouldn't just walk out of here. She'd make sure the world never forgot why she was put in here in the first place. And she wouldn't be the only one walking free. The metal door clicked shut behind her, and Olivia Connors exhaled slowly, the cold steel of the chair pressing against her back. The interrogation room was sterile, lifeless, just a metal table, two unwelcoming chairs, and a flickering fluorescent light overhead that hummed with a relentless, almost taunting persistence. She wasn't just here because of a misunderstanding. She was here because of something deeper. Something ingrained in the way people like her were seen, judged and discarded without hesitation. Minutes stretched into eternity. She could hear the low murmur of voices beyond the door, the rustling of papers, the faint shuffle of hurried steps. She let her hands rest flat on the table, fingers lightly tapping, an unconscious rhythm that kept her from unraveling the tangled mess of emotions in her chest. The camera in the corner blinked its red light, recording every second, every breath, every flicker of control she refused to surrender. Finally the door creaked open. The older officer entered first, his expression unreadable, a thick folder clutched in his hand. The younger officer followed, his posture stiff, uncertainty creeping into his features. Olivia could see it in his eyes, hesitation, doubt, perhaps even a sliver of regret. The older man cleared his throat, flipping open the folder as he spoke. "We've reviewed the store's security footage," he began, voice clipped, procedural. "It appears there was an error. You didn't attempt to steal anything." A pause, and then, as if the words physically pained him, "We apologize for the misunderstanding." Olivia let the silence stretch. Let them feel it. Let them sit in the weight of their mistake. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice slow, deliberate. "Is that what we're calling it?" Neither officer responded immediately. The older one barely flinched, but the younger officer shifted, visibly uncomfortable now. "I was accused, humiliated, dragged through a store in handcuffs like a criminal," she continued, her words slicing through the thick, stagnant air. "And it was all just a misunderstanding." The younger officer opened his mouth, perhaps to stammer out another empty apology, but Olivia didn't give him the chance. She pushed her chair back, rising to her feet with the kind of quiet authority that had once made boardrooms fall silent at her presence. "This isn't just about me," she said, voice sharp as a blade. "It's about the countless people who go through this every day. The ones without cameras, without influence, without a voice loud enough to demand an apology." The officers said nothing. They didn't need to. The truth was already unraveling around them. As Olivia stepped out of the station, the night air wrapped around her like an electric charge. The moment her feet touched the pavement, she knew something had shifted. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, over and over, a storm of missed calls and unread messages. By now the video of her arrest was everywhere. The young woman from the supermarket had uploaded it, her caption cutting through the noise like a blade. This woman was accused of stealing before she even reached the checkout. "Look how they treated her." The footage was raw, undeniable. The officers tightening the cuffs, the gasps of the crowd, the way Olivia had stood tall despite it all. Within hours the internet had exploded. #Justice for Olivia was trending. So was #Bias in action. Thousands of voices, demanding answers, demanding change. At first she ignored the flood of notifications. She needed to think, to strategize. She wasn't about to let this spiral into just another viral outrage cycle that burned bright and faded fast. She understood power, real power, the kind that shaped narratives, that forced institutions to reckon with their failures. And so she issued her own statement. Short, controlled, powerful. What happened to me is not unique. But now we have proof. Let's make sure no one ignores it. As she pressed send, Olivia knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The world had seen the video, millions of eyes, millions of voices, all watching, all demanding answers. But Olivia Connors wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for change. She sat in her office, the city skyline sprawling out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Journalists, activists, corporate leaders, even politicians, all wanting a statement, a reaction. But Olivia wasn't interested in empty words or reactionary outrage. She was thinking about strategy, about impact. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "They're ready for you," her assistant said, her voice tight with anticipation. Olivia rose, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, her expression unreadable. It had been a week since the incident, and in that time, everything had changed. The supermarket was facing national scrutiny, boycotts, and public protests, demanding justice. The police department was under fire, their procedures questioned, their accountability challenged. But Olivia wasn't just here to talk about that. She stepped into the conference room, where a dozen corporate executives sat waiting, representatives from the supermarket's leadership team, their faces lined with exhaustion, nervous anticipation. Their legal teams had no doubt advised them to settle, to issue another generic apology, and move on. But Olivia had other plans. She took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over them. "Let's not waste time," she said coolly. "We're going to talk about real solutions." There was a brief, tense silence before the store's CEO cleared his throat. "Miss Connors, first, allow me to extend our sincerest apologies. Apologies don't prevent this from happening again." Olivia interrupted, her tone firm but measured. "Actions do. Policies do. Training does. I want a full-scale anti-bias training program, implemented across every one of your locations. Real training, not a one-time seminar you check off a list. I want a review of your hiring and promotional practices, and I want transparency. Because what happened to me, it's happened before, and it will happen again unless something changes." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. The PR disaster was already spiraling beyond their control. They needed a way out, and if we agree to these terms, one of them asked cautiously. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. "Then you won't just be fixing a problem, you'll be leading the solution. You'll be setting a precedent for corporate accountability nationwide. And trust me, the world is watching." Across the table, expressions shifted, hesitation giving way to calculation. They knew she was right. Meanwhile, the police department faced its own reckoning. The video of Olivia's composed yet defiant arrest had ignited a firestorm, forcing law enforcement officials to address their own failures. Officers were placed under investigation, press conferences were held, but Olivia wasn't interested in performative damage control. She met with city leaders, demanding new policies on de-escalation training, mandatory body cameras, and community oversight committees. This wasn't about one incident, it was about systemic change. And as the movement grew, so did the pressure. The protests outside the supermarket swelled. Justice for Olivia had transformed into a broader demand for reform. The conversation had shifted from one woman's wrongful detainment to a nationwide call for accountability. A week after the incident, Olivia stood at a podium outside her foundation's headquarters. Hundreds of reporters and supporters gathered before her. Cameras flashed. Microphones leaned forward, hungry for her words. "I've spent my career building technology to change lives," she began, her voice carrying through the crowd. "But technology alone can't change the systems that govern us. That takes people. That takes action." She let the words settle before continuing. "What happened to me is not unique, but for once there was proof. And now we have an opportunity to demand better, to build better." The crowd erupted in applause, but Olivia wasn't finished. "To those watching, to those who have experienced this before, to those who have felt powerless, I see you, we see you. And this is only the beginning." The movement had started, and Olivia Connors wasn't backing down. The shadow of doubt, the cold metal of the handcuffs burned against Mira Lawson's wrists as she sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her pulse hammering in her ears. A single flickering bulb cast erratic shadows on the walls, the silence stretching thick between her, the two officers standing across the table. "We have the footage," the older officer said, placing a thick file onto the table, with an ominous thud. "You were there. You had motive." Mira exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "I don't even know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The younger officer hesitated, shifting uncomfortably before pushing a grainy photograph toward her. It showed a woman, dark hair, same build, same height, leaving the back entrance of a luxury boutique. The timestamp was clear, 8:37 p.m., the exact time Mira had been walking home from her friend's cafe, alone. Her stomach tightened. "This isn't me," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew how hollow it sounded. The figure in the photo could have been her. The hoodie, the posture, it was an eerie likeness, but she hadn't been there. She hadn't stolen anything. The older officer leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "Then explain how we found your fingerprints inside the store." Mira's breath hitched. "What?" A slow chill crawled up her spine. This was wrong, so wrong. The boutique in question wasn't even a place she had ever stepped foot in. Her mind raced. Had she been framed? Was this some kind of clerical mistake? Or was something far more sinister at play? The younger officer, the one with uncertainty in his eyes, cleared his throat. "Look, Miss Lawson, we just want the truth. The evidence isn't looking great for you." She clenched her fists beneath the table. "Evidence? But evidence could be manipulated. Evidence could be planted. I want a lawyer," she said firmly. A muscle twitched in the older officer's jaw. He tapped the file once before exchanging a glance with his partner. Then, without another word, he stood and left the room. The younger officer lingered for a moment, studying her carefully. "You should really think about how you want this to go," he said quietly, before following his partner out. The door clicked shut. Mira sat back, exhaling shakily. She had two choices: wait and hope the system worked in her favor, or fight to uncover the truth herself. And Mira had never been one to wait. The moment she was released on account of insufficient evidence, she hit the ground running. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had used her as a scapegoat. As she retraced her steps from that night, piecing together alibis, checking security footage, and digging deeper into the boutique's records, an unsettling realization took shape. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a setup. And whoever had done this wasn't finished with her yet. The vanishing hour. The rain came down in sheets, soaking the deserted highway as Evelyn Carter gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The headlights of her car barely cut through the thick fog, but she didn't dare slow down. The eerie silence of the night was punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. She glanced at the passenger seat, where a manila envelope lay open, its contents spilling out: a stack of aged photographs, a single silver key, and a blood-stained note with 4 haunting words. "He knows. Leave now." Evelyn swallowed hard. 2 hours ago, she had been in her apartment, sipping tea, wrapped in a blanket, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. "Get out. They're coming for you." At first she thought it was a prank, but when she peeked out her window and saw a dark figure standing under the street lamp, motionless, she knew it wasn't. And now here she was, fleeing into the unknown, clutching clues that made no sense. Her mind reeled. Who knows? Who is after me? She reached a desolate gas station, pulling in beneath the flickering neon sign. Inside, an old man sat behind the counter, eyes glued to a static-filled television. The place smelled of stale coffee and damp newspapers. "Rough night," the cashier muttered without looking up. Evelyn hesitated. "You could say that." She placed a 20 on the counter and grabbed a bottle of water, but just as she turned to leave, the old man spoke again. "You got here fast." Her breath hitched. She turned slowly. "Excuse me." The man finally looked up, his milky blue eyes locking onto hers. "They told me you'd be coming." A cold dread curled in her stomach. "Who told you that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips twitched in something that was neither a smile nor a frown. Instead of answering, he reached under the counter and slid something toward her, a motel key. "Room 17. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. "Stay inside," the man said. "And whatever you do, don't open the door for anyone." The world felt like it had tilted sideways. Nothing made sense anymore, but she took the key, her fingers trembling. As she stepped back into the night, the rain had stopped. The air was thick, too still, like the earth was holding its breath. Across the lot, the rundown motel loomed in the darkness, its neon vacancy sign buzzing erratically. Something was waiting for her in room 17, and Evelyn had no choice but to find out what.